So one time in seminary, we would take a class called Clinical Pastoral Education. So it was a CPE, as we called it, and it was known back in my time, it's a lot lighter now, of just offending each other as we learned to do ministry and criticize each other. And so, of course, one guy did not like me in the class and my approach, and so he said something that I found pretty offensive about me. And I went to my spiritual director. As you know, you could say 1,000 nice things, but someone say one negative thing, right? That's the only thing you remember. So I went to him and I said, can you imagine that he said this? And, I'm not going to tell you what it is. But anyway, it's not true. And that's what he asked me. He said, is it true? And I said, no, of course not. It's not true. He said, then let it go. Then why are you bothered by it? And I'm like, it's not that easy to just forget when you're offended, right? But that was the advice. And 35 years later, I still say, is it true? Then let it go. But this idea of being offended, and that's what struck me in today's reading, is that the disciples tell Jesus, the Pharisees are very offended by what you said. And I thought, well, that crime of offending people has been around for a long time. We nowadays, it's a great defense, right? I find that very offensive, and then you're supposed to always be very attentive to not offending people, right? Even if by anything that we said. And then sometimes we think today that it's an easy way to throw something up that you don't like. You're like, I'm offended by that, and not that I would ever promote going around offending people on purpose, and saying all kinds of offensive things like some people might want to do. But what we see, though, is Jesus saying something that offends somebody. And the example that the response that he gives is, what I said was true. He said, they're offended. He said, every plant, he said, leave them alone. The blinds, they don't understand, they don't know. And so he says the Pharisees are blind to their sin, and of course they would be offended. If ever you are offended, right, by anything, by the faith maybe, or by what someone says, the same thing I ask that was asked of me, we ask, is this true? Is it what I said something true? Or sometimes we get offended because it might touch something that's within us. That might be a sin. And we hang on to that, and we are offended because there's the truth that was said instead. And so that takes a lot of honesty to kind of turn around and say, when we're dealing with whether we're offended or offending someone, what it means to live in the truth and how that works with us. And so you could see that sometimes even Jesus could be offensive to the Pharisees because they stuck to their tradition. And Jesus was trying to tell them, look, sometimes it's not that's going to doing the external things, but an angry heart or an unforgiven heart or what comes out of our hearts is a lot more sinful and a lot more that we need to be attentive to than something that we do in our traditions. And that's a hard thing for us to say, because not that we didn't do our traditions or our things, but when they're done for the sake without the purpose behind it, because then Jesus says that's not what it's supposed to be about. And you can see that people who hung on to tradition would find that very offensive, right? And so that's why in today's gospel, Jesus even says, look, a blind man leads a blind man, they both will fall into the pit, right? And so our goal, hopefully, in our relationships with one another and our staying in the truth, that we find courage even if what we say might be offensive, right? As long as our goal is to live in the truth, and our truth comes from Christ. And so that ultimately becomes our measuring system, and then our goal to stay that way in the truth. Then when we speak, it's true, we'll have to deal with the fact that some people will not like what we say. We know that already. We can't be long here. However, finding the courage to recognize that, as Christ says, living in the truth, living with what is right and good and holy in a world that doesn't always appreciate that, will find that offensive. And sometimes even our own spouse, our family members will be offended by something that is true. But for sure, that doesn't give us the license to just go around, say what we want, and offend everybody in the name of kind of a defense for God. But trying to find the gift of discernment and the gift of prudence of when and how to say the truth, recognizing that sometimes it will be offensive.